So this whole journey, we've talked about loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourself. In this session, we want to ask this question: who is my neighbor? What's that mean to love my neighbor as myself? And what's going to be required of me? I like this definition of a neighbor. A neighbor is whoever God brings into your natural path of life. Okay? So I'm married and I have children. So my first neighbors would be my wife Heidi and my children. Okay? They're my closest in neighbors. They're in my natural path of life. And then you would like push it out from there, right? So you could say things like my extended family, my sisters and my brother, my nieces and nephews. You could say my extended circle of friends, right? So I have friends all over the place, friends at church, friends in the community, etc. I have literal physical neighbors, like the people who live next door to me or in my neighborhood. These are places that God has placed me. If we believe in the sovereignty of God, that God organizes and kind of orchestrates our life, then God has placed me in these places and has placed these people around me so that I can express His love to them for Him, right? I'm an ambassador of Christ. Then there are people that it feels like they randomly show up in our lives, but they don't, right? So it literally is like the homeless guy I bumped into, or the guy at Subway that made my sub, right? And I'm like, why am I suddenly in this conversation with this person? Well, if we believe in God-ordained moments, which we do, then we would look and say, okay, well, everybody that God brings into my life that's part of His plan, and I get the chance then to influence them and help them. Now, to live like that, I got to let you know that it may require some mindset changes that go back to how we view God, okay? So remember that, is God inspecting? Is He disappointed? Is He distant? If God is an inspecting God, then someone could come into my life that I might be afraid would contaminate my life, right? And I might push them out of my life because I don't want them to cause me to be a sinner or make my life yucky, right? If God is a disappointed God, then somebody could come into my life and I might feel like they may not let me get to church enough, or they may not, right? And so I would push that person out of my life. If God's a distant God, you get the idea. So what are some of the mindset shifts that would have to happen in order for me to kind of fully engage my neighbor as a follower of Jesus? I put some of these down. For instance, one of the things that might have to happen is I might have to allow my understanding of purity to be changed. Here's the question: do I avoid people in sin, or do I move toward them? Jesus really set some pretty high standards here, some really good illustrations. He went toward the adulterous woman. He went toward the tax collector. He went toward the prostitute who wanted to wash His feet. Jesus wasn't all about making sure His image was kept up and nothing like gross ever came into His life. He would move toward them. And if I'm going to love people, I'm going to wind up being around the mess of their life sometimes. And so that has to shift. Being a follower of Jesus is not elevating and isolating myself from the grossness of the world. It's actually the opposite. I'm moving toward the least of these, toward the mess, and bringing the light of Jesus into those scenarios. Another idea that may have to shift is my idea of Christian living. So if you were raised in a tradition like mine, Christian living was all about appearance. Don't smoke, drink, chew, date girls who do kind of thing, right? My hair was this way, I dress this way. Jesus' idea of a Christian life was I hang out with sinners. Like I eat with them. I bring the good news of the gospel. In fact, the Bible says in the New Testament, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news, right? So like a win for me as a follower of Jesus may not be that I attend Bible study 5 days a week. A win for me, maybe I attend a Bible study once because I want to learn the Bible, and I invest the rest of my evenings with people who don't know Christ so that I can bring the good news of Christ to them. And then a third mindset shift that might take place is this idea that there needs to be a shift in our sense of ownership, okay? We tend in our culture to have an out-of-sight, out-of-mind kind of way of living. A Christian, a follower of Christ, is one who takes ownership over people's lives that they may not naturally have any other reason to own, okay? So if I'm a 25-year-old guy who's unmarried and I have the ability to kind of live life the way I want to live life, and I drive down into the inner city to volunteer one afternoon because I was going to paint a wall somewhere at a inner city center, and all of a sudden this 8-year-old boy attaches to me like I'm his big brother, a Christian might look and say, wow, this young boy needs a father figure, needs someone that can teach him about Christ, needs someone who can be an example in his life. I might take ownership of that relationship even though I don't really have to, because it's not like it's my kid, right? If I'm a Christian couple and I've got my own children, and I find out that God somehow allows me to find out that there's this big need for adoption in Guatemala, right? I might suddenly take ownership of a child that I wouldn't necessarily take ownership of because I've got like my own things God's got me working on. But a loving neighbor, see, is seeking to do that. So that's what happens. I love my neighbor as myself. My eyes turn very much outward. And I'm looking at all these relationships that God has in my life, kind of irregardless how they show up or why they show up in my life. We're going to like assume that they were brought there by God. And then I'm looking and saying, wow, how can I bring the gospel? How can I bring the love and the truth of Christ? And how can I do that? When I do that, I'm loving like I've been loved, right? So Jesus is in heaven minding his own business. We're his rebellious creation. What's his motive for stepping out of heaven and coming to earth and dying on a cross? See? Only love. Jesus went toward the center, not away from it, right? Jesus owned that relationship. Jesus moved toward it. He loved us. And he looks at us and says, hey guys, love other people like I loved you. And that's kind of the plan. And I want to partner with you in doing that. So as you unpack that, I encourage you to think about people in your life. Like, who could I be praying for? Here are the people in my life. How maybe I need to look at that relationship differently. How could I look at it as a neighborly relationship? That kind of conversation as you go through this part of the one-step journal, and think that through. How do I do that? How do I partner with God and embrace his mission and be a part of that by loving my neighbor?